Hi everybody, this is Larry up in Brandon, Minnesota. This is part 3 of a series I'm doing on understanding all about vermiculture, vermicomposting, composting worms in your garden. What I want to do in this video is explain what to do when you get your worms, the correct container to put them in. Different worms require different situations, different beddings, different temperature ranges and things like that, and I want to cover that. The first video, if you haven't seen the previous 2 videos, I'll put a link below this video. Make sure you go back and watch those first. It'll bring you up to speed and you'll know exactly where we're going with this. In the first video I did understanding vermiculture, composting, and worms in your garden. Okay, second one I did was on the 4 kinds of worms that I'm talking about in this series, which are red wigglers, European nightcrawlers, African nightcrawlers, and the Alabama jumpers. Okay, the first thing you want to do when you get your worms is try to arrange it with your shipper or whoever you're getting worms from, that you know when they're going to be there. Check your tracking number out. Make sure they're not left out in the sun or the rain or blazing hot situations and stuff like that. Make sure you're going to be around to pick your worms up. Get them inside right away. Get them open. Get them out of the box. A lot of them are going to come 2-day priority, 3-day priority boxes. Open them up. Check them. Get them some air. Worms got to have air. They're a breathing organism or animal just like everything else. They got to have some air. Get them out, check them, see how live they are, that they're in good condition. If you have a problem at that time is the time to contact the shipper or the worm seller that you got the worms from. Check them, make sure they're good. Now this is where you want to be prepared in advance, and that's what we're going to go over to. So you don't get them and then say, well, now what do I do? Okay, we're going to prepare that. The first 2 worms, and they're kind of grouped together, we can do these together because they're pretty much the same, is the red wiggler and the European nightcrawler. Both excellent composting worms. Like I said in the previous video, the red wiggler is a great composting worm if you just want to use it. You can use it for a fishing bait too, but it's a pretty smaller worm, but it's a voracious composter, okay? The European nightcrawler gets bigger. You can grow them pretty good size, and they're a lot of the commercial growers grow these in large numbers to supply bait dealers across the United States for the panfish and brim and that market for the fishing bait. So it can be a bait, it can be a size worm that you can not only use for yourself, but potentially, and I'll get into it later in the series, be a profit-making worm. If you want to start a little business with the family and the kids want to sell some worms, or if you're a serious entrepreneur and want to be able to market some, that's something you might want to consider, the European nightcrawler, because they're a very popular worm for the fishing industry. Anyway, what we want to do is there's a couple different ways that we can take these worms and what containers in. One of them I'm going to go with is something that I played around with, and I think it works good for me, and I really like it. And that's it's a no escape proof container. What I do is I take a 5-gallon bucket, and you can get these at Walmart, bakery, your local grocery store, any place that has a bakery department. Ask them for them. They're food grade, non-toxic. And here's a bucket I got at my local Cub Foods, and it had frosting on it and stuff. And here's a little video I did on it. Okay, let's talk about how to make a super easy escape-proof bin for worms. Okay, this is just a standard 4-gallon, I think it's about a little under a 5-gallon bucket that I got at my local bakery in my Cub Food store. They just gave it to me free. I got about 5 or 6 of them with lids. And here's what you want to do. They're going to have frosting or something in there. You can wash it out, okay? But I got a lid for it. And what you want to do is make sure that lid has that O-ring in it. See that rubber O-ring? The reason for, if you get a bucket without that and just snaps on, the worms can possibly go through that little, it's amazing what they can get through. With this rubber seal, because it could have liquid in, believe me, the worms will not get out. What I did is I had a hole saw. It was a 4 1/4 inch one I used for my pop-out garden, which I just made an air vent hole for, which worked really good. you can just take a jigsaw and do the same thing, cut a hole, just make sure you leave a good rim around. This way you can still access. I can get in there, I can add food, and these tabs, I really like these on this because it's easy to remove this lid. So I just take this lid off, and then I can add my food right in there, and so I take a misting bottle and spray the top. I only use one bucket here, and this one I don't have any drain holes, because I've been around messing with worms long enough. I know how wet to make it, and so I don't have to have the drain holes for the. You could, if you were worried about it, you were going to have too much liquid, just put another bucket underneath this, drill some holes in the bottom of this bucket, and that way any excess liquid would fall into the bottom bucket. But this is a very easy, escape-proof way to make a bucket they'll put your worms in. I like it. I prefer this even over the bend method, because it makes it very handy. When they've ate up all the compost, it's very easy just to dump this out as something that's very. I've seen a lot of commercial worm growers that do African night crawlers and do this. Matter of fact, what they'll do is they'll take a bucket like this, and they'll put the correct amount of bedding in it, and then they put in the correct amount of food and everything, to right moisture level, and they'll just they do it like in 14 days. And when they get done, the worms have completely composted all the material. They usually use a peat, and they'll put a peat moss in there. And what I like to do, if I'm going to use peat, and a lot of it, and I do, is I like to go ahead and get a 1/4 inch or an 1/8 inch screen. Just build one out of a box and get some hardware cloth and pre-screen your peat, because it's going to come in bales, and there's going to be some sticks and different things in it. I like to do that because then when I get done with the peat and I dump the bucket out with the compost, it's going to be just beautiful. I don't have to go through and try to sort it then. It's already been pre-sorted. The worms have consumed all the food, and you can feed it with different things. A lot of times I like to go with grains, a good chicken mash you can put on top, or how I'll explain about taking your foods and grinding them up and then freeze them in cubes, and I'll get into that a little bit later about exactly how to do that in the feeding portion. That way you're not overfeeding or anything like that. You're only putting small amount. When it's all gone, it's gone. And when they've composted all the bedding material, now you can just dump this out, sort the worms out, and you got beautiful compost that doesn't have sticks or other things that you need to pick out. So if you pre-sort your potting mix, whether you use shredded newspaper first, a whole bunch of that, they'll eat that and that'll be fine too. But I kind of tendency to I'll buy peat in the fall when it's dirt cheap. I just picked up 32 bales of it for $3.38 at Walmart. It's usually about $9, $8-9. So this is the time of year to buy that stuff, and then it'll last forever almost. So anyway, I want to show you this real inexpensive, escape-proof bucket system for growing your worms in. Okay, this is probably one of the most common ways, if you see any videos on YouTube or something, about making a worm bin. They use like these standard 18-quart plastic totes, and they work fine too. I have European night crawlers in here, and I've got a wet newspaper that I like to put on top, holds the moisture in, and they will really like to come up underneath that and feed. If I'm going to put a little grain, or I'm going to put a little some ground up food right underneath there, then I can keep this wet and they'll come right up and feed it. You can see, I'll lift this. These are European night crawlers under there, and man, they have really started to grow. I took, matter of fact, a little pumpkin that I had. It was in a can, ground up pumpkin. It was just regular pumpkin, and I made a little hole here. You can see it, and boy, they just love it. They just come right up and just eat the heck out of it. Well, I just barely bury it, and I only put enough there that they're going to eat in a couple days. There's no sense putting a whole bunch of food out that they're not going to be, and then you don't have to worry about fruit flies and all kinds of other things. If you have enough food there for the worms, they're going to consume it in a couple days, and you can add some more. That's the whole point. But this works great, and then I'll dampen this every couple of days when it starts getting dry, and then put it back on there. And then I always lift this off, and I take a misting bottle, and I just mist the top. I can use only one bucket. This one, there's perforated holes around the sides. You can drill 1/8-inch holes all the way around for ventilation if you want to put a lid on, and then put holes in the lid itself. This one I had got from a friend of mine, and he had drilled some holes in the bottom too a little bit, and he has it setting on another tub and then has it raised up with some cups. You could use a little 2x4 to leave up a little space, so if you would overfeed, any additional liquid would go down into that. Here's the thought on that. I have studied this quite a bit and talked to some professional worm growers, and some don't like the worm tea that you get from the bottom because they say it's anaerobic. It's been setting down there, it doesn't have oxygen, and they just assume if they're going to make a worm tea or something, make it out of the actual compost itself. They know it's alive, it's fresh, and do that. I kind of feel the same way. I can get by with just one bed because I've been messing around with worms long enough that I can wet the bedding just like a wrung out rag when I first start, and just by misting it and adding this top, I can keep it at a nice moisture level, so I never have to worry about the bedding getting too wet. If you're going to add food scraps, then I will talk later in the video here on how to do that to regulate that so you don't have that massive overfeeding. If you put tons of lettuce and cucumbers and things like that that contain a lot of moisture, you can really make that bedding wet. There's ways to regulate that by, and I'll explain that later in the video, how to feed them correctly so you get away from that problem. Anyway, the bend method's another one, and like I had showed you in the other one, doing the bucket and no escape one is another. You can also do this in various ways. You can do this in any container. You can build a wooden box. You could do it in an old refrigerator, chest freezer outside. If you want to run, if you want to do that, and then I would recommend you do put holes in the bottom of that, so it can drain out if you would have. But keep it in a shady spot first of all, and keep it out of the rain, so you don't, the rain's not falling in and over flooding it, and do those things. But I want to show you the bend setup here. Pretty simple, not a lot about that. Okay, now that I've showed you the escape-proof bucket system, that one, and the bend, like I said, you can raise them in a chest freezer outside. Put that in a shady spot out of the rain. That's going to work for that. There's another method you can do. Say you don't want to do any of that. You want to just add them to an existing compost pile. You can do that to help speed up the breakdown of the compost, yet you could still dig down in there and get some worms if you're going to go fishing or you want to get some. However, remember this, if you're up in the northern hemisphere where it freezes pretty hard in the winter, you're going to probably lose them unless you put some fresh compost maybe on and cover them. I'm not sure on that, but I'm just saying don't expect to have them there. The compost worm, your natural worms can go down a tunnel. Your compost worms cannot. If it gets very cold, it could freeze them all the way out. That's why you can bring them indoors, or some of them. You could even do it in a compost pile. Harvest some before winter, bring them inside, raise them, build up your stock, and then reintroduce them back out into your compost pile again. There's one other method I wanted to show you yet. It's called the worm in. It's a pretty clever setup. It's a continual flow-through system. It's made out of a fabric, and it has a screened top. It's really neat. That's so no fruit flies or anything can get in. You can feed your compost in the top, your scraps into the top. But what's really clever about this system, the flow-through, is at the very bottom you uncinch the bottom end. You can take out freshly done compost that's fully done, and then when you start getting in any worms or compost that hasn't been your food scraps hasn't been fully done, zip it shut and let the worms do their job again. It's a continual thing. Of course, at some time you would dump it out, harvest your worms out when you got so many of them, and either start another one or put the worm somewhere else and use it. But I wanted to bring it up because it is a pretty clever thing. It's called the worm in. I wanted to show you that. What I want to do now on these red worms, okay, we're going to talk about some bedding. And what we can do with this bedding is we can do multiple things, okay? You can use straight peat. If you want to just go get peat in the bales and sift it out, like I said, the reason that it's really nice because you get the sticks and everything out of the way up front, so you're not dealing with them later. Then you want to take a little if you're going to do this tub like that, I would say about a cup of garden lime, mix in the peat, and it's dry. While it's still dry, it'll mix better. And then you can put that in. That can be your basis for it. You can also use just shredded up newspaper. Soak the newspaper in a bunch of water, weight it down with something, put it in a big bucket or something, weight down a bunch of newspaper, and let it really soak up good. Then take it out, rip it up, and wring it out really well. Wring it out and put that in. You can use that for your bedding. Okay? You can do that for virtually all the worms, but especially the red wiggler and the European Nightcrawler. And you want to fill it about 2/3 full, and then we're going to add the food part. But that's what I wanted to really, the food part I'm going to talk about at the end of this video, because there's a couple of little clever ways that we can do that. But on the red wiggler and the European Nightcrawler, you can raise them indoors, you can raise them outdoors. Like I said, you have to be aware that in the wintertime, they're not going to survive. These are composting worms. These are not regular worms that can go burrow down like a Nightcrawler or a regular earthworm into the ground and get away from the frost. So you need to keep that in mind, that towards winter, if you're in the southern state, you can get away with it leaving it in your compost pile. If you're in the northern states where it freezes hard, you're going to have to move some indoors to get away from that. But like I said, the bedding, you can use newspaper, you can use some broken down leaves, you can use a combination of all of them and stuff. But for basically for these two worms, I like to use the peat. It's what a lot of commercial growers use. It's easy to work with. It's nice and clean. If you pre-screen it when you get done, your castings are just beautiful. I like it. If you want to mess around with the newspaper, go ahead and do that. That also works too. But that's on these two worms. Okay, let's talk about the African Nightcrawler. I guess I could have grouped that with the other two in the fact that they do well in shredded newspaper or peat also. Feeding with them is a little differently, and when I get into the feeding aspects of the worms, I'll get into that on each specific worm and what works best for them. But yes, you can do the African Nightcrawlers in the same way. Their temperature ranges are going to vary from other worms. I'm going to get into that. If you're in a real hot area of the country, African Nightcrawlers might be your best bet for composting. And if you're in Arizona, the desert or something, it will stand higher heat than any of the other worms. But the bedding, as far as those three, are the same. The other one I'm going to bring up now is going to be the Alabama jumper. Okay, the Alabama jumper is a ground dirt worm. Okay, it is like the Nightcrawler in a lot of senses that it will burrow itself down in the ground. It will go below frost levels, 12, 13, 14 feet. It is a great garden worm. It loves clay. It'll bust up clay like crazy. If you don't even want to mess with any of the vermicomposting part of the whole thing, this is the reason I grouped it in with the other worms, is because some people still want the benefits, but they don't want to raise worms in any way, shape, or fashion. If that's the case, Alabama jumper is probably the worm for you. You can get it, you can put it in your garden, it will eat what's there, but it will break up the soil, and if you, even in a northern part, they've claimed they've raised it as north as New York, and it's survived. I guess what I would do is I would cover just to ensure that a little bit, what I would do is cover my garden with some straw or some leaves in the fall after the first frost, and that would ensure that you might help protect those worms so they didn't have to go as deep and they could be okay. But as far as holding them, say you want to get them and they were pretty little and you want to grow them a little bit or something, here's what I do, and I'm experimenting around with. And that's, I took the no escape proof buckets, which you've seen, okay, and I did a mixture of I had some leaf piles that have been set for quite a long time. I dug at the very bottom of them, got down some of that leaves that were really broken down. I put that in about a third. I put about a third peat in. Then I even added, I could have done some newspaper, but I just happened to, I grabbed some bust bedding that I had, and I mixed up some bust bedding, and I put that in. It has some food quality in it too, and I put that in. I put a little lime in, a cup of limes into that too, into that whole mixture. That did a couple buckets worth. in a big bin and mixed it all. Do everything dry. It'll mix up so much better. Then when I got it damp where it was not soppy wet, but you could pick up a handful, squeeze it, and get a couple drops out, and it's just about right. That is what because I'm trying to emulate the ground, the way they're in. You could even throw a little compost if you had a little, if you had a little rabbit manure or something like that, the heat was out of, you could even throw a little bit of that in, even cow manure or horse manure, if it was well composted, just to give it a little texture to the thing. And that's what I'm trying to raise those in. Like I said, there isn't a lot of study I've read. I'm reading a lot of stuff from a couple guys that are really experimenting with trying to hold them indoors and things. And that they're doing things like that. Some are using really well composted wood shavings, hardwood. Stay away from the ones with pine and stuff like that. And but try to use some hardwood shavings that are really broken down and mix that in too. You want something, because remember, these are tunnel dwellers. They're not like a regular composting worm. They will eat up the material and create compost, of course, but they like to tunnel down. So if you want to fatten them up that way for fishing or something like that, it might be something to play around with. But if you want a great worm just to buy and put in your garden that'll bust up clay like no problem, extremely lively worm, extremely tough worm, unbelievable. Matter of fact, yeah, here's a video right here on the Alabama jumpers. They are crazy. Unless you see this with your own eyes, you will not believe it. These are Alabama jumpers, and for a good reason. Look at them. Alabama jumpers. You ever seen a worm like that in your life? Crazy. Totally crazy. Yeah, them are some crazy worms, huh? Okay, here's what I'm going to do. Rather than run this into a very long lesson on the worms in vermiculture, we covered different ways that you can raise them. And the same with those Alabama jumpers, okay? You can put them in a compost pile. You probably could get by if you put them in a compost pile even up in the northern hemisphere, where they would go below the frost line and they would be okay. They could compost your pile. They could go in your garden. As long as I'd put some leaf mulch and different things in there, or they'd be perfect in a raised bed and things like that, and hopefully they would come back. And like I said, I would, just to ensure it, cover them with some leaf and straw or something in the fall. But they're a great worm, just right out of the box. Get them and put them in there, you can do them. So we've covered the different kinds of containers you can raise them in. The no-escape bucket system. You can do it in a bin system. You can do it in an outdoor freezer. You can get these big agricultural tubs. That would work. You can do it in the worm in, which is a clever little setup. You can do that if you want to do it indoors. Or you can set that outdoors. I would make sure no varmints or anything could get at it. Raccoons will rip the bag open or something like that. But I'm going, okay, what I'm going to do is break this up and finish this up, this video. Next one I will tell you exactly how. Now these vary by temperature. Each worm has a little variance as far as temperature. The African Nightcrawler does not like to be held in certain colder weather. It'll kill it. The European Nightcrawler and the red wiggler are much more tolerant for colder weather. I'm going to cover how to hold them in the environment that you need to put them in, and the temperature ranges, and the correct feeding. Some like different foods better, some like it presented to them differently, and I will cover that in this next video, okay? So this is Larry up in Brainerd. Ciao.